Welcome to the Brighten Up Podcast, where we shine light on stories of strength, growth, purpose, and explore how challenges can truly bring out the best in us. I'm your guest host for this episode, Jared Pennington, where we are shedding some light on how the foods we eat, our sleep patterns, and how much we exercise really plays a role in your overall mental well-being. I've been a PA for 21 years, practicing most recently in some virtual primary care and virtual psychiatry. Donna is not able to be here with us this evening. She asked me to be the guest host for this pod. She will also start to bring in guest hosts along the way as we expand our reach a little bit with the podcast. So I'm excited to be here. I'm excited to have our guest on today's episode. Today we are talking with Dr. Michael Asbach. He is well known to the mental health space as a psychiatric trained physician assistant and currently Associate Medical Director at Dent Neurological Institute in Rochester, New York. He earned his master's in physician assistant studies from Damon University and his Doctor of Medical Science from A.T. Still University. He holds the Psychiatry Certificate of Added Qualification from the National Commission on Certification of Physician Assistants. He is a nationally recognized educator, CME speaker. He specializes in treatment-resistant depression, bipolar disorder, and emerging psychiatric therapies. He holds a faculty appointment with Shenandoah University's Doctor of Medical Science program, teaches across multiple universities, serves on the Psych Congress Steering Committee, which he's been very passionate about, sits on the editorial board of Psychiatric Times, represents the American Academy of Physician Associates as medical liaison to the American Psychiatric Association. So welcome, Dr. Asbach.
Thank you. So happy to be here, and I really can't wait for this conversation, Jared. It's I think something that thankfully we're talking about more and more, the role that lifestyle and different interventions can have on our wellness and mental health. So I'm excited for the next half hour. Yeah,
this is great. I mean, looking at where psychiatry has come, gone, how far it's come, and, this is, I think, a way that we kind of break away a little bit from traditional treatment with medications, think about other ways in which we can help a patient along in their life cycle by just maybe changing little things that they do every day. Can you walk us through the biological connection between what we eat and how we feel? What's actually happening in our brain and body?
We always want to think about what we're inputting into our bodies, and I think it's quite intuitive that we recognize if we eat junk food every day, that physically it's going to have an impact on our bodies. If I am training for a marathon, or if I am preparing to be a power lifter, McDonald's probably won't cut it. No offense to McDonald's, but I need to put good things in my bodies, good macros, the right amount of protein, the right amount of carbs, all of that. And yet our brains are no different. Our brains need fuel. Our brains need the right fuel. So I think thankfully we're starting to have a greater understanding of those biological connections between our nutrition and what that does for us in terms of wellness. So just to give a very broad overview, we don't need to get too in the weeds, but nutrition can really influence neurotransmitter synthesis, so it can play a role in how our brains create and have available for us serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine via different building blocks that are needed to make those neurotransmitters. So just making sure we have the right material to give our brains the neurotransmitters that they need is step one. More and more research supports that mental health ties into chronic stress and chronic inflammation. Diet can have a role in neuroplasticity. So this is one of the more exciting aspects of mental health in the past 10 or 15 years. Is historically we've thought of the brain as static. The whole idea that your brain doesn't ever change, it doesn't ever regrow, it can't regenerate. And certainly that is still true. If a neuron dies or if you have a stroke or something, it won't regrow. But within the brain, we have what's called neuroplasticity, where there's a constant pruning and adjustment happening, where different neurons are getting more attention and having more growth, where other ones are trimmed back. And that pruning and adjustment phase is so critical to making sure that our brains are adaptive and able to address the challenges and needs that we have in life. We talk a lot about the HPA axis, which is kind of the mind-gut connection. I think the HPA axis is important. Sometimes I think we get a little bit too hyper-focused on it, but we know that there is a big connection between our gut microbiome and the influence that it has on our brains. So to kind of put a bow on it, there's a lot of things that we're throwing out there, Jared, is that food is not mood magic. I wouldn't consider it the end all be all. And that's actually one of the things that I hope we'll talk about. I think lifestyle interventions within mental health are incredibly important, but we also want to make sure that we don't become hyper focused on what we're eating to the detriment of other positive things that we can do to help with mental health, whether that be other lifestyle interventions or potentially good evidence-based psychotherapy, or in some cases, psychopharmacology if we do feel that meds are necessary.
Sure. Yeah. I think it's so important, and as you were talking, the medicine and the physiology behind it, I think it's always kind of hard to talk to patients about this in a way that they kind of will understand and really take to heart what you're saying. I think there's so much out there and there's so much conflicting information on nutrition. Every time you turn around, there's somebody else telling you something in conflict with what you read the day before, maybe about nutrition. So what do you think are the most evidence-based dietary patterns or principles that you talk to patients about that are probably the most tried and true regimens that you see are the most helpful?
This is where I think sometimes as clinicians, but then also as patients, we can get ourselves into trouble. If we take an extremist approach to anything in life, even good things in life can be bad in the wrong proportions. And I think diet can be that way as well. So I don't like restrictive diets. I don't like fad diets. I don't like the idea of doing anything that is too weird, for lack of a better term. And unfortunately, I think social media is just littered with pure bananas for a whole weekend. You'll cleanse your system. If you only eat chia seeds for 35 days straight, then everything will be right in your life. And a lot of times those really don't have a ton of evidence behind them, but they also are not good for you. The science just isn't there. So in my opinion, one of the best, strongest evidence bases in terms of mental health and nutrition is just a Mediterranean style of eating. And what we mean by that is I like to tell patients, just look for whole foods, look for lots of fruits, lots of vegetables, lots of whole grains, things that are as minimally processed as possible, lots of olive oil, fish. If I tell a patient, hey, eat a Mediterranean style diet, they may not know what that means. That may sound overwhelming to them. So I always like to frame it as try to avoid processed foods. And even that sometimes can be a little bit overwhelming for patients. So then we'll get a little bit deeper into it and talk about when you go to the grocery store, try and do all your shopping on the outer edges of the store. Because if you think about it, every grocery store is set up. The produce, the fresh meats, fruits, vegetables are all going to be on the outer ring generally. The middle aisles, those are all the shelf-stable foods that are made with highly processed, refined carbs. Those are the things we want to avoid as we're trying to optimize the way that we approach this. But I do worry with my patients, with clinicians, that very often with diet, we let the pursuit of perfection get in the way of good. So I'm really always looking for my patients to just make small incremental changes. Instead of going to fast food twice a week, let's try and replace that with something that can be done that's an easy, quick meal, because a lot of times we're getting fast food because we don't have the energy to cook. So if we have nights where we know we aren't going to be able to cook, what can we do as an alternative that is going to be a more suitable replacement? Maybe it's a quick pre-made salad from the restaurant or from the grocery store or something like that that can allow us to make small substitutive changes.
That's great. I actually just heard somebody else was talking about that the other day, and I never really heard it put in that way when you kind of look at the grocery store and see where you should shop, and it does make sense. Mm-hmm. And a lot of them are kind of spread out like that, certain things are in certain areas, and you can't go from one good area to another without passing all the bad foods.
One of my favorite books that I read recently, it's called The Comfort Crisis by Michael Asbach, and he talks about that these highly processed foods, they hit all the right dopamine reward systems for us. Our bodies, from an evolutionary standpoint, are built to crave fats, sugars, and salt, because those are the things that we needed to survive. And up until 100 years ago, there was probably greater risk of starvation than obesity-related death. So we're evolutionarily trained to pursue these really high caloric density foods. And now we have an industrial food complex that has made tons and tons of money by creating foods that, kind of trigger all those warm fuzzies for us because they're calorically dense foods. So the key with that is if we're eating a sleeve of Oreos, our brains may not tell us, hey, I'm full, I've had enough, to shut off at the proper time, versus if we're eating a salad of kale, or if we're eating something, a fruit, a veggie, something that is less calorically dense, our bodies are going to have a better opportunity to step in and say, hey, that's enough. You don't need to eat 35 pounds of strawberries. Maybe just a couple is good. Where that becomes very difficult because we're having to fight against those evolutionary impulses with those highly processed foods.
That's such great information. In your practice, do you refer patients to dietitians and nutritionists, things like that, when you really think that changes to their lifestyle? And we're going to talk about exercise and sleep, but those changes would be very helpful to their specific condition.
I don't do a ton of it, and the reason is not a willingness, but rather a lack of availability, a lack of access, and a lack of affordability. So some insurances will cover nutrition and nutritional counseling, dietitians for patients that are struggling with diabetes, with obesity. I don't know of an insurance company that will allow a dietitian or a nutritionist for mental health. So certainly I may have patients that have mental health struggles and they're obese, mental health struggles and diabetes, but my hope is that we're actually going to be able to catch those patients farther upstream. We know that depression, for example, leads to higher risk factors for almost every physical condition, but certainly diabetes, stroke, heart attack, obesity. So untreated depression makes everything else worse. But at the same time, if I have someone who's in my office who is depressed, we're talking about different dietary interventions to try and maximize mental health. I can't send that person to a dietitian, at least not have it be covered by insurance. So I think it really ends up being something that we could look at a policy level, where if we know we have more and more data to support that diet and nutrition makes a huge difference in mental health, one way that we could make an effective intervention there is to start covering that, to allow patients that are struggling with mental health to receive good nutritional counseling.
Yeah, I think it's so important. I think, in primary care, when you have somebody with cardiovascular disease, somebody with diabetes, somebody with chronic renal insufficiency, approaching end-stage renal disease, or even mild renal disease, we know that diet really is effective, and it really, talking to an expert, not just talking to me for 15 minutes about it, is going to be maybe not that impactful than actually sending them. And that's really why patient-centered medical homes exist, so you can hopefully bring in those resources into the practice, or at least have that available to the patient. But in the mental health space, we don't think about that as often. And I'm sure you think about it a lot more often than primary care clinicians, because it's not part of the knee-jerk reaction to help their condition, whatever they may have. So I think that is really important. It's just advocacy and trying to make this known, and really getting more clinical trials out there and more data to prove this to the larger community. So,
and the tough thing is we need the policy change. In both mental health and primary care, we have an incredible shortage of providers. So most primary care, most mental health is quite overextended, where you may be seeing 3, 4, even 5 patients an hour. So it's a wonderful and admirable idea that instead of having dietitians brought in, well, why can't primary care, why can't mental health do that counseling? And we certainly can. And I try to do that with my patients. And my hope is that with technology, we will have more opportunities to kind of follow on with different technological supports, apps, things like that can help educate the patient. But the reality is that without policy change to provide reimbursable codes, to provide opportunities for those dietary counseling, nutritional visits to be covered by insurance, it's really challenging to fit that in when we already have a system that is overworked and kind of pushed to its limits.
There needs to be a real shift in a lot of different ways that we treat patients, and a lot of the resources that potentially could be available to people that aren't necessarily in reach at this time. Mm-hmm. Why don't we switch gears a little bit? We'll talk about exercise. So this is another thing that in the primary care space, we always are talking about exercise, right? 150 minutes a week of exercise for pretty much everybody, walking, moderate resistance types of activities, things like that. And again, In the primary care space, it's usually people with cardiovascular disorders, diabetes, hypertension, things like that. And we know that exercise is extremely impactful in the mental health space. And again, when I talk to patients about that, it doesn't hit home as hard as, hey, you need to exercise because it's going to help your heart. And exercising because it's going to help your brain is not as well known. It's not as in vogue for people to think that way. So when we think about exercising, if we're going to educate a patient with mental health disorder on exercising, what types of exercise or what type of movements would you recommend for them? Or is it just about getting out there and doing anything that's more than, just being sedentary?
All of it. Any movement is good. I'm such a big believer in exercise and activity. I think the data is profound in the mental health space. I think exercise is one of the most potent interventions that we can offer to our patients. I also think it offers some of the best accessibility and equity, because regardless of location, regardless of what resources you have, what access you have to outdoor space, we can find ways for our patients to be more active, even if that's doing jumping jacks in their living room, even if it's just doing stairwells in their apartment building. There's opportunities to get our patients moving. The average person in the U.S. moves very little. They are incredibly sedentary, and I think this is a huge thing that we're seeing as mental health is worsening in our country. I think it correlates quite tightly with our lack of activity as more and more jobs are becoming ones where we sit at the computer, but also we're becoming just less active, less social, more isolated. More and more of our free time is spent in front of a screen in our living room as a solitary activity, as opposed to going out and doing things with people that maybe are physical and active. So when I talk to my patients, anything. I don't have any preference of you should do this versus that. I just want to get them moving. In terms of motivation, what do we look for? For my patients, I generally want to try and identify things that fit into their daily routine. If I tell someone who has never gone to a gym before, get a gym membership, start going for 30 minutes every morning, they may go, but everyone makes fun of New Year's resolutions for a reason, right? Everyone shows up at the gym January 2nd, and by February 1st, they're gone. And the reason being is building in new habits is hard. So I always want to try and look at the patient's daily routine, daily habits, and see what we can do to build that out. For example, in my clinic, I'm going to use myself as a great example. My job is very sedentary. I work in mental health, so I see patients in my office. I always joke with my other healthcare colleagues, because I'm not zooming around from exam room to exam room. I'm seeing patients in my office. I get to drink coffee all day, but it also means that I get very few steps in. One of the interventional psychiatry clinics that I oversee at my practice is in a different building, and it's 6 flights away. So instead of taking the elevator, I take the stairs. And on an average day, I get 40 to 45 flights of stairs. So I get my 10,000 steps. I'm getting lots of good muscular strength training activity by doing the stairs as well. And for me, that's something that I'm able to implement in my daily routine, where I'm not having to significantly change what I'm doing from a day-to-day basis, but rather making a small substitutive change where instead of taking the elevator, I take the stairs. Those are the types of interventions that I look for with my patients. A little bit more granularly, whether we look at aerobic exercise versus strength training, I'm starting to kind of, I think at this point I would look at strength training as being the superior intervention. I think strength training is a little bit better for patients both physically, but then also from a mental health standpoint. But that doesn't mean that aerobic or cardio is bad. That doesn't mean that it's not good. It just may not be as good as strength training. So again, I don't want to worry with my patients though about, oh, wait, you're going for a run 3 times a week? No, don't do that. Go lift at the gym. If they're running and that works for them, wonderful. But I think just getting movement, getting them active. And the other thing I'll add to this, if you can tell I'm really passionate about it, I'm getting all worked up, is I think one of the best and most potent things that we can do for mental health, and this is not for people that are just struggling with depression, but all of us can work to optimize our mental health, is find an activity that is physically active that is some sort of sport or active activity that also involves community, because that gives us this kind of holy trifecta of mental health wellness. And ideally have that be something that's also outdoors, because then we're getting light exposure, then we're getting, the benefits of nature. There's actually a lot of good research that being out in nature can have a really big benefit. There was one study looking at patients that went for walks in the city versus walks in the park and found that walking in the park was better for mental health. So if you can find an activity, and maybe that's joining a running club, maybe that is having a group of friends where every Saturday morning you go for a bike ride together, maybe it's joining a climbing center, maybe it's going for a Sunday morning kayak with a couple friends, but finding something that is active, physically demanding, but also a pro-social activity, I think is really one of the best ways that we can leverage exercise for our mental well-being.
I would always encourage my patients as well to, find somebody to do these activities with. Yes. And you can catch up, talk with that person, whether it's friends or family. It's a reason to get together, when you maybe normally wouldn't get together. Exactly. Even for myself, I struggle as well going to the gym, checking that box. And I notice that when I go and get it done, you feel better, right? You check that box off for the day. Now, is that a change in my, brain chemistry that I feel better? Or is it just that I check the box off? I don't know. I know it makes me feel better that task is done for the day. And it's a good task, something that's really helping you. So the hardest part is actually getting in the car to go to the gym, or putting on your shorts to come down to the basement or wherever you go to exercise. So just by doing the task itself, I've found that it just kind of lightens your load for the day, so.
Yeah, I agree.
If you talk to somebody about exercise and they do start implementing something and they hadn't done anything before, how quickly do you notice changes in them? I mean, I know maybe medications are a factor. There's all these confounding factors, but how quickly can you expect for somebody to come in and talk to you and say, hey, I really think that this, amount of exercise, whatever I'm doing, really has helped me?
Yeah, I think specific to exercise, this is one of the other reasons that I'm so passionate about it, is I think you get a pretty fast return on investment. And it's exactly what you just said, Jared. There's this immediate behavioral reward that happens where if we go and we lift heavy things, I think running can do it too, though, where, if I go for a run, I feel incredibly accomplished afterwards. But there's something very unique and wonderful about lifting weights or doing resistance and strength training where you come off of that and you feel really confident, you feel really accomplished, you feel like you've done something really challenging. That reward system that we're hitting on is incredibly beneficial for our mental health, both in the short term and long term. So I like that. I think it gives us a very immediate feedback loop that tells us, this is good, let's keep doing it. I totally agree, Jared. I'm the same way, where it's getting to the gym that's the hard thing, especially when it's 5 degrees outside and you have to drive there. It gets challenging. But in terms of where do we see results, when I talk to patients, especially specific to exercise, I always like to try and tell them, if we're building in a new habit into their daily routine, my goal for them is to try and do that for a month before we sit down and assess whether there's been any significant change. I also like to try and build some metrics in as well. I think sometimes in mental health we get hyper-focused on the symptoms of depression, and we may use rating scales like a PHQ-9, and that's incredibly helpful, but at the same time, the whole purpose of medicine, and certainly in mental health, is to restore premorbid levels of functioning. So I also want to talk to my patient and say, okay, if you're going to be going to the gym, if you're doing that, what are some metrics that we can use to try and identify if we're having success? Maybe that looks like re-engagement in activities that they used to enjoy. Maybe it's more regular sleep cycles. A lot of times when patients start to exercise more regularly, they're not staying up until 2 a.m. doom scrolling or watching TV because they're tired. They're going to bed at a more regular hour. They're getting more regulated sleep. Maybe they're starting to eat healthier because they're recognizing that, after a workout, a little bit of creatine and protein is a good thing, and that's changing their habits where they're not hitting Taco Bell on the way home from the gym. So there's a lot of different things that we can use to measure, but I generally like to encourage patients, plan on consciously making this habit change for a month, and then we'll get back together and reassess and determine what we like, what we don't like before we make any alterations to the game plan.
Yeah, that's great that you said that, because once you start engaging in that exercise and you start feeling better, maybe you start seeing some changes in your body even, you tend to naturally want to eat healthier, right? And like you said, going to the gym instead of sitting at home for an hour watching, a show. I've had patients for sure that come in struggling with sleep. They have some type of insomnia, whether they can't get the sleep or they, wake up in the night multiple times, and you tell them to not pick up your phone and all these other things. But I have found that people that tell me that they're more tired during the day because of exercise, that tends to work, and I feel like all the sleep aids from a medication standpoint that we can throw at people, really not that helpful from what I've seen over time. There's not one magic medication we can give somebody for sleep, but those other factors do definitely make a difference. Yeah, so I feel like sleep is huge. So food, exercise, also extremely important, but like you just said, it all ties together with sleep. And some people will say, I don't need much sleep. I need 4 hours of sleep and I'm good. Some people, they don't have any trouble sleeping 12 hours. And we know that the optimal sleep time in general for somebody is a good 7-8 hours of sleep to be the most functional. But we also know that sleep affects mental health and how somebody feels the next day based on how much sleep they had. And we know that things like anxiety can cause sleep problems and other sort of mental health disorders. When you have somebody that comes in that maybe has a mental health diagnosis, they have some issues with sleep, how do you talk to them about that conversation of...
It really is interesting. I've only been doing this for 14 years, so I like to think I'm still on the upswing of my career. And yet, just in 14 years that I've been practicing in psychiatry, there has been a shift where when I first entered psychiatric practice, we still had this concept of primary versus secondary insomnia. And the idea being that secondary insomnia was, well, they're not sleeping and it's happening downstream of anxiety or whatever it may be. And at the time, there was a more hierarchical approach. And the idea was, oh, well, if you have someone that is having insomnia as they're depressed, we just need to treat the depression and the insomnia will then subside. And more research now supports that insomnia is a 4-alarm fire. We need to make sure that we're addressing it. We need to view it as a comorbidity, not as something that's happening downstream of other issues. And the reason for it is exactly as you laid out. People that are not sleeping well, it has incredible damage to the brain. And when I say damage, yes, I'm intentionally being hyperbolic, but to use as an example, one of the most important lifestyle modifications that we can make to reduce risk of Alzheimer's disease is getting 8 hours of sleep every single night. If we are sleep deprived, it is equivalent to being legally drunk. It has an impact on our cognitive performance. Certainly chronic sleep deprivation can increase inflammation within the body because a lot of reparative work within our brain and in our bodies as well happens while we sleep. So we become more prone or more chronically inflamed, and that can lead to poor mental health outcomes. So sleep really is an important thing. And the exciting thing with sleep, I agree with you in terms of meds, is while we do have medications, most of those medications for sleep are not meant and have not been studied to be used as long-term maintenance meds. Almost every prescriptive medication that we have for sleep, and if you look at these sedative hypnotic medications, almost all of them to a T, if you read their product insert, will say not recommended for greater than 3 months of use. They're meant to be used more episodically. So if you have someone who is going through a very stressful life event, maybe they're having some big project at work, they've got their child's wedding is coming up, it may be reasonable to give them a short course of a sleep medication to make sure that poor sleep then doesn't lead to greater susceptibility of depression, anxiety in this high stress environment. But for most people, if we're looking at sleep as a chronic thing that we need to manage, it is far more valuable to constantly be assessing different factors that can promote good sleep, but also addressing those factors that may cause poor sleep, such as screens in the bedroom, caffeine too late at night, exercise too late. Those things are all things that we can make adjustments to in our daily life, and they really can have quite an incredible impact on sleep. I found with my patients that a lot of times just some very basic education on sleep can go a long way. One of the most effective things that I tell my patients is not complicated or difficult, is that a bad night's sleep is almost always followed by a good night's sleep. And I think what often ends up happening with sleep is you have some anxiety about it, where if you struggle to have good quality sleep, you have a night where you're up till 2 a.m. and you're staring at the ceiling tiles and you're starting to get anxious and worried because you're thinking about all those meetings that you have the next day and how tired you're going to be. The next night, though, you're probably going to get a pretty solid night's rest because you're going to go into that day that much more fatigued. So a lot of times it will self-regulate. What we need to do is identify those things that help disrupt circadian rhythms, such as caffeine, scrolling social media at 2 a.m. because we can't sleep. Those things aren't doing us any favors.
I totally agree. And I see a lot of sleep issues with, not even, people that have a normal routine and they just can't sleep. And it's just, we have people that work crazy shifts, people like us, healthcare providers, healthcare workers, plenty of people in other professions that work different times of the day and night, and switching those shifts back and forth all the time, really is hard because, it's hard to even have patients, even if you want to prescribe them a medication for sleep, it's hard because it might work for them, but then they might wake up kind of groggy, more tired, not able to work, especially if they go into a job where they're need to be alert because they're operating, equipment or something like that. And I feel like it's a real struggle, so I think in those cases, you tend to at least I tended to focus more on how we can change the lifestyle a little bit outside of work, or even like you said, while you're at work, you're actively thinking about these things, taking the stairs, doing other things. But it's just really hard for people's lifestyle in general because of their work commitment, their family commitments, taking care of maybe a sick loved one.
And sometimes we have no good options. We have to bargain for the less good option, right? I have 4 kids and they were all 2 years apart. So we had essentially 10 years of poor sleep because some child was getting up in the middle of the night. Some child was having nightmares. That is not something that you can adjust by avoiding caffeine. It's just an inherent part of life. If you are a law enforcement officer, you will work overnights. You will have 1 week where you're working nights and the next week you're working days.
Right.
And the hard thing is to tell a patient that's working overnights, hey, on your day off, I'd really like for you to keep your normal schedule and still sleep during the daytime so that you're not messing your circadian rhythm up. They're going to look at you cross-eyed because their day off they want to spend with their family, with their loved ones, but that also means that they're probably going 24 hours straight because they're going to come off shift, and instead of going to bed, they're going to stay up. So it really is a challenge. And in those cases, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer in the sense that everybody is going to be individualized. And this is where medicine is fun. Medicine can also be very frustrating because we have to really think and work with our patient with the constraints that they have, and then build with them a plan that works for them. And it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all.
Very complex issue, and it takes a lot of work from both the patient side and the provider side to try to come up with a plan to really help them. So if you have somebody, say a patient, major depressive disorder, that you're meeting maybe for the first time, and you really feel like they need to make a change to all those things, their sleep pattern, their dietary pattern, getting more exercise, how would you start? Because when we throw all these things at patients, and stop smoking, start exercising, stop eating, you tell them in a 15-minute visit to do all those things and probably not going to do any of them. So, what do you think out of those 3 areas of nutrition, exercise, and sleep, you think they should start with? Maybe because you feel like it's easier to start with one, or one has the most or the greater impact than the others?
Yeah, so I'm actually going to take a step back from that, and I'm going to first say that my assessment would be for a patient that's maybe struggling with depression is what is the functional impact of their depression? So the CANMAT guidelines, the Canadian medical guidelines for the treatment of depression, which are one of my favorites, they're very comprehensive. Exercise, lifestyle intervention is considered a first-line therapy for mild or moderate depression. But moderate to severe depression, we see pharmacology as first-line therapy. And the reason for that is quite logical. If you've got someone that has mild symptoms of depression, maybe moderate symptoms, but they're not having a huge functional impact, they're still rather intact, they're going to work, they're meeting their obligations at home and at work, that's someone where we can probably look to make interventions in their daily routine to try and help with the depression. If I have someone who's depressed and the depression is so severe that they're not showering every day, that brushing their teeth is an overwhelming activity, I can't intervene with lifestyle. I need to focus on getting that patient more functional and having some restoration of functioning before I can think about the more natural lifestyle intervention. So step one is to think about where they're at in terms of their functioning. But if I had 3 interventions for someone that came into my office, the things that I would look to do to start off is, if the patient doesn't have any level of activity right now, is I would try and encourage a daily walk for 20 minutes. And certainly that can be hard in colder climates. I'm in Buffalo. I know you're also in a colder climate,
Right.
But my counter argument to that is everywhere else in the world figures it out. It's a relatively uniquely American sentiment that if it's below 40 degrees, we can't go outside. If you go to Nordic countries, if you go to Sweden, Norway, they're outside all the time. They take their babies outside when it's below freezing. It's 0 degrees and their babies are napping in the tram outside the coffee shop. If you go up to Canada, go to Toronto and look at how many people are walking around in the middle of the winter. So I want my patients to be safe. If the road is icy, if the road is covered in snow, don't walk. Be reasonable. But at the same time, I try to encourage them to go for a walk every single day. I also like starting with walks because I think there's a little bit of a mindfulness, meditative nature to walking as opposed to lifting or even running, where if someone's going for a walk, hopefully maybe they're putting headphones on, they're listening to a good audiobook, they're listening to music that they enjoy, or even without that, they're maybe thinking, they're kind of working through their thoughts. So I think there's a meditative property to going for a walk that can be very helpful as well. From a sleep perspective, I would focus on establishing a regular wake-up time. And the reason I like doing that is I actually like to focus first on wakeful periods as opposed to sleep, because I don't want to add any extra pressure to the nighttime routine. And the reason being is I don't want people to say, okay, I'm going to go to bed at 10 p.m. every night, and then 10 p.m. rolls around, they're not sleepy yet, their mind is still racing, and then they're trying to force themselves to go to bed because they want to adhere to a schedule, they want to try and stick with a good circadian rhythm. But that can lead to anxiety and pressure. So rather, the first intervention that I would do is I would look at wake-up time. I would say set an alarm 7 days a week, get up at 7 a.m. Even if you slept terribly the night before and your temptation is to sleep in to catch up on sleep, get up at 7 a.m. No naps during the day. Try and be as active as you can during the day, because a bad night's sleep will almost always be followed by a good night's sleep. So I always like to start by establishing a consistent wake-up time, and then I'll slowly work my way backwards towards trying to make adjustments to the nighttime routine. From a nutrition standpoint, I always like to shift it back to the patient. If I tell them, here's what I want you to do from a nutritional standpoint, the likelihood that I'm going to have buy-in, that they're actually going to implement, I think is fairly low. So we talk about the Mediterranean diet, we talk about eliminating or reducing highly processed foods, and then I ask them, I say, let's look at your average week. What are 3 things that we can do in an average week to try and swap out something that's highly processed for something that's a little bit healthier? And let the patient decide. Maybe they look at that and say, every Tuesday night I go to Taco Bell. And yes, I keep referencing Taco Bell because I love Taco Bell. It's my guilty pleasure. But, every Tuesday night I go to Taco Bell. Instead of going to Taco Bell, I will cook at home. That's a huge win. That's a big, big win. Maybe it's, every Friday night I go out with friends and I have 4 or 5 beers. Well, from my perspective, I don't necessarily want them to not go out, right? I think the social connection of going out is a really good thing. But maybe instead of 4 or 5 beers, we can do 1 or 2 beers and then switch over to a non-alcoholic seltzer or something that has lower calories. So these little substitutive switches, but I always like from a nutrition standpoint to let the patient identify those. And then hopefully that allows for more shared decision making, but also buy-in from the patient.
That's so important. I think you then figure out what's most important to them and what you think they would potentially start making an impact on. I mean, this goes all the way back to, still around smoking, right? It's different forms of smoking. But it's like when we talk to people about quitting smoking tobacco or cigarettes, we know the stages there that, we need to walk through. And it's kind of the same thing for somebody who, with any type of diagnosis, who you're recommending exercise, even, somebody that comes in the first time for a physical, you're going to recommend exercise, you're going to recommend a healthy diet and sleep. I think it's just, we have to understand where the patient's coming from and what stage are they in of the transformation, and then kind of work towards that, and I feel like some people who haven't even thought about it before, or there's maybe a barrier to why they won't do it, you're just not going to convince them to start doing that. There's some misconceptions sometimes with people when you talk to them about certain treatment options, certain home remedies, certain, holistic approaches to their disease process that may help. You might always be met with some kind of questions from the patient that they've read something that's totally different from what you're saying. So are there any misconceptions out there that you feel regarding any of the things that we talked about, food, sleep, exercise? Yeah, that you are constantly like re-educating the patient on, because maybe what they're hearing is just not correct evidence-based information.
I think the wellness industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry that has a lot of good. There's a lot of really high quality things in the wellness industry that can be very beneficial for our health. But the wellness industry is also littered with bad actors, bad data, and things that don't have good science behind it. And one of my biggest problems with the wellness industry is we don't have good gatekeeping. There's not good opportunity for people to say, well, this is good, do this. This isn't really well founded, don't do that. So I think one of the challenges here is we always want to treat the entire patient. And we want to approach mental health in the biopsychosocial model. There's an opportunity for medications, for therapy, but then also lifestyle modification and more holistic approaches. But the key is that in all that we do, we need to be evidence-based. We need to make sure that anything that we're recommending as a clinician has evidence to support it. And we also need to be very clear about the things and the levels of evidence that come with that. A prospective randomized controlled trial is very different than making recommendations because there was a cool study that involved a couple rats. So sure. I think one of the challenges within this is when you don't have medications that are approved or regulated by the FDA, like the pharmaceutical side of it, there's less regulation, there's less oversight, and there's more onus on the clinician and on the patient to do their own research and to discern what is good and what is not. And that's a big challenge. So one of the things that I feel like I'm constantly pushing back on patients, trying to address misconceptions, is the idea that all pharmaceuticals are bad. Because I think, unfortunately, we live in a world now where if it's a prescription, that means it's not good for me. Right. In that all wellness interventions are good. And there are a lot of really great wellness interventions, but there's also things that don't really work or are just a little bit wonky. So, essential oils are a great example. There's a lot of essential oils that if you're ingesting them, it's not good for you. It's going to make you really ill. Yes. And yet, at the same time, if it's an essential oil, I think often our patients view that as, oh, well, it must be good. It comes from the earth. Well, so does arsenic. So I think we always need to be incredibly careful. And one of my passions here is not to dissuade patients from pursuing more natural approaches, but to help educate them on how they can be better consumers within the wellness industry.
Yeah, it's so important. We're constantly fighting against this as clinicians. And, and even as more information comes out, AI becomes, more available to people. AI can be a great tool, but, you have to, make sure that you're getting the right information from that, because it could also be a terrible tool for patients. when they're looking for information. I mean, we thought patients who, are just going on Google and looking up their diagnosis or treatment options was bad enough for us to have to really talk through the evidence. Now we have this whole other level of technology, which is AI. We want patients to be informed, but obviously informed with the right information.
Yeah, I just had a psychotic patient who showed me her ChatGPT conversations, and ChatGPT was affirming her delusions because she was telling ChatGPT, there are men outside of my house watching me. What should I do? And the response from ChatGPT, understandably, was not call your doctor. It was, okay, if there's people surveilling you, here's what you want to do next. And it just fed into those delusions. So, bad data in, bad data out. It is something that is going to be an ever-growing problem as AI continues to become more ubiquitous in the healthcare field.
Yeah, I mean, I had a positive side, and I don't know what the AI tool was telling the patient, but I had a patient that, and I asked her if she was in therapy, because I would meet her probably every 4 weeks for medication management. And, I said, are you still going to therapy? And she was. It wasn't weekly. I think it was, every other week or every third week. And in between, she was talking to an AI tool for therapy. And I forget which one she told me, but she felt it was extremely helpful for her. Mm-hmm. So, as long as if you're using the right tools, maybe more of the evidence-based tools that are out there specifically for whatever purpose you're looking for could be extremely helpful. And for this patient, it was hugely helpful. I mean, night and day difference over a couple of weeks. So
any disruptive technology has both good and bad. Right.
Well, talking about the intersection of food, sleep, exercise, these are all things that are not foreign to any of us. We, these are constantly on our minds every day. It is important to talk to patients about these issues. And, I think patients appreciate us not throwing medications at them all the time and having some other way to give some benefit to their, to really help their mental health disorder. And a lot of patients, as don't want to be on medication. They kind of want to come off medication, and, therapy is great, but therapy, along with all of these lifestyle changes could be very powerful.
The goal is always to minimize pharmaceutical intervention, and not because meds are bad. That's what I always hammer to my patients.
Right.
But rather because meds have trade-offs. They have side effects that come with them. So if we use the meds as a tool, certainly, there's people that have incredible benefit from medication. There's also people with mental health struggles that need to be on meds. But the goal is always to get to a point where we can start deprescribing and not have as many medications on board and take a more holistic approach, because the side effect profile is going to be far, far better if we're exercising, if we're engaging in therapy, as opposed to antidepressants that may have trade-offs such as weight gain or sexual dysfunction or other things like that.
I totally agree with that. Any last-minute words of advice you want to give to our listeners?
This was a wonderful conversation, and I think the last thing, if I'm thinking about a takeaway from this, is that exercise is one of the best things that we can do for our patients. So I would prioritize exercise in all of these things that we talk about, but then also considering a tailored approach. As clinicians, one of the most important things that we can do is build trust with our patients, build therapeutic alliance, and then use that relationship to help navigate and make treatment plans that set our patients up for success. That's not just with picking medications, but also with how we navigate and build out lifestyle interventions to optimize mental health for our patients.
Great words of wisdom there. So, well, thank you, Dr. Michael Asbach, for coming on the pod. And, I hope that we can have you on in the future to talk about some, future topics in mental health as we care for our patients. So thanks again for coming on the pod. We'll see you next time.
Thank you so much.